Good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to be here with you at this hour. I would like to thank the organizers for putting together this particular panel, which in many ways summarizes and links many topics that we've been talking today. And it's also, of course, an honor to speak in the presence of President Mbeki, who has done so much for African agency that will be a leading theme here for us. So the title of this session implies that there is a tension or balance that needs to be supported between three different objectives: security, commerce, and inclusion. But if you look behind the surface, they are all in many ways complementary goals. They don't need necessarily to compete with each other. And this is also something that we want to unpack in this panel. So we have heard today about energy transitions, connectivity, climate finance, the creator economy, and many other examples of where commerce, security issues, and inclusion intersect. Each of these debates covers one area. Our session here is to take one step back, look at the bigger picture, and see how these three say something about the underlying power architectures and how they link up with each other and interlock. And so to deal with this, we have this capable and all-covering panel, I would say, that covers geopolitics, as well as geoeconomic and geointellectual competition in a way. I'm going to go straight into it, and I would like to start with the bigger picture. So, and I'm going to ask you, Apoorv, to deal with this. So, how has the shift from globalization to geoeconomics reshaped strategic autonomy? And what does non-capture mean for this global moment?
Thanks, Jens. Let me begin by making 5 quick observations about the theme. 1, we are navigating not a triangle, but a trilemma. In macroeconomics, we talk about an impossible trinity, that between free capital flows, stable exchange rate, and independent monetary policy, countries can't have all three simultaneously. You have to choose 2 out of 3, depending on your economic priorities. Our panel lays out the geoeconomic version of this impossible trinity. Countries cannot simultaneously have commerce, security, inclusion. They have to choose 2 out of 3, but this choice must be based on their national priorities. It must not be forced upon them by nations which control what I call the plumbing of the global economy. And that's the effort we have to make collectively as the international community, but especially as the global south. The second observation that I want to make is that weaponization of economic interdependence is neither new nor a Western prerogative. I mean, there is an urgency on this issue because of the economic balancing that has been happening for several decades, in which there is now a greater salience for the global south. And so it is a success in this interdependent world which makes the pain of weaponization that much more acute. I mean, think about how the Nazis in the 1930s weaponized economic interdependence to cause bloodless invasions in countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. I mean, more recently, the United States, by its control over internet protocols. Think about the use of gas pipelines and energy infrastructure by Russia. Think about the use of BRI and digital infrastructure by China. So weaponization, like I said, is neither new, neither is it a prerogative of the West. It's just that it's our success as the global south makes this a more urgent issue today. The third point I want to make is that despite the convergence of COVID, conflict, and chaos coming from DC, we still live in a very interconnected world. I mean, the ratio of world trade to GDP has flatlined and sort of remained leveled since 2011. This is both good and bad news. This is good news because it means that globalization still matters, but it's bad news because it means that the pie of trade and consequently exports is not increasing. And so this model of export-led manufacturing driving economic development, especially in global south, has begun to see its limits. So how has the global south responded to this? 2 things. A, what we've done is we've redrawn the lines of trade. Right? In the last 15 years, South-South trade has doubled from $2.3 trillion to about $5.6 trillion. And two, there is an increased focus on domestic consumption as a driver of growth. And you see this at least in India with our focus on deregulation and reducing tax on consumption. What we are telling is that yes, we will continue to compete for export markets, but that is becoming more and more challenging. But simultaneously, we will also focus on internal drivers of growth. And I mean, from 2010 to 2023, the share of trade to GDP in India fell from about 49% to 46%. In China, this was more drastic, from about 51% to 37%. By contrast, in Europe, this share went up. So Germany went from about 74 to 83%. France went from about 57 to 77%. And therefore, when trade becomes geopolitical, it hurts EU more than some of the other countries that over the last few decades have tried to limit the role of trade in their economy. The fourth point I want to make is that the increased salience of the global south has come at the cost of developed economies. Trade between developed countries in 1995 was about half of the total global trade, 50%. Today, it is just 39%. And what's happening, a lot of the political convulsions that you see today is a consequence of this economic rebalancing. As advanced economies began to lose in this interdependent world, what you saw is that there was an increase in protectionism in advanced economies. Every economy since 2010 has become more protectionist. But do you know which country has the maximum number of trade distorting policy interventions? United States, with about 9,459 such interventions. India, by contrast, has about 1,989 such interventions in the same period. And so and the second thing that has happened is, of course, there's increased protectionism, but because they're losing, there's also increased weaponization of international law, especially international trade law. I mean, we blame Trump for the demise of the multilateral trading system, but its demise started under Obama. You know, when he strangled the dispute resolution mechanism of WTO by not appointing a South Korean judge who he thought was not sufficiently aligned with US interest. And then when two other judges were not appointed in 2018, the entire dispute resolution system of WTO became in limbo, which meant that trade by necessity had to become bilateral and regional because the multilateral trading system was not working because there was no way to enforce these rules due to the failure of the dispute resolution system. So this aggressive posturing by the West has made strategic autonomy, which is a Cold War concept, suddenly fashionable again. It has made resilience as the antithesis of efficiency suddenly fashionable again. And let me tell you, this focus on diversification, decoupling, de-risking of supply chains, I mean, it started with COVID. We say that adversity doesn't make character, it reveals character. And Global South saw the behavior of countries during the pandemic, not sharing vaccines, hoarding medical supplies. And that is why you see suddenly the salience of strategic economy. Let me end by saying what this means for the Global South and the way forward. We have entered an epoch where global public goods will become a central element of geopolitical strategy. Global payment infrastructure, monetary system, trade sanctions, MNCs violating contract terms, global consulting firms sharing sensitive national data with foreign governments and foreign clients. All of this will be the new ether in which globalization will unfold in the coming decades till we reach a new equilibrium. So what must the Global South do? Let me end with 3 quick suggestions on what we can do together. 1, let us build norms and safeguards to prevent the indiscriminate weaponization of the plumbing of globalization. 2, let us ask for and insist on greater representation for the Global South in the plumbing of the global economy. And let me give you a very specific example. Once we discovered that how the International Accounting Standards Board had colluded with big financial institutions to cause the financial crisis of 2008, it was the G20 that asked for a reform of the IASB and ensured that there was a public monitoring board of the International Accounting Standard Board, and there was a greater representation for Global South in the bodies of the IASB. 3, while we continue to reform the existing plumbing of the global economy, we also have to build together viable alternatives and backups for this plumbing. So think about alternate payment systems, alternates for telecom equipment, alternates for companies that can lay out the subsea cables that drive our digital economy. The mere existence of these viable alternatives will encourage good behavior from states that currently control these nodes of the global economy, and it will expand the policy space available for Global South so that the choices they make in answering this dilemma are their own. It's not enforced upon them. Thank you.
Okay, no, but that's very. Thank you very much for that. You covered a lot of field, and I think that what we will do now in the next with the next three panelists is to unpack that a bit. And let's first turn to geopolitics, and I would like to invite Kyung-Jin to lay that out, because security is a word that comes up more and more. Our economies become securitized, and economic security is becoming a new guiding framework. So, tell us a little bit about that and introduce us to that way of thinking.
Thank you, James. The US-China power competition largely dictates the commerce and security relations of many countries. But ironically, the US-China competition highlights how deeply intertwined our commerce, security, and inclusion are. They not only coexist, but reinforce each other. Take an example of maritime security. I'm from a country with one of the world's highest trade dependency, along with Germany. So 90% of Korea's economy is dependent on maritime trade and the overall stability of the Indo-Pacific. So stability of the Indo-Pacific, which is home to the world's most critical sea lanes and frequently affected by non-traditional security threats in its waters, is of utmost importance for not just the economy, but also the survival of Korea. Hence, Korea has been expanding its maritime security cooperation with the Indian Ocean Rim countries and the countries in East Asia and the Pacific. Critical minerals is another area where commerce, security, and inclusion coexist and reinforce each other. 90% of the global critical mineral supply chains is controlled by China. So, by innuendo, China can go against the notion of commerce, security, and inclusion when it comes to critical minerals, if it so chooses. Many like-minded countries can act together for stability and resilience of critical mineral supply chain. The same goes for pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and etc., where China is quickly expanding the global share. And I can come back to the question of critical minerals later, time permitting. The question of critical minerals is a core pillar of diversifying supply chains, which is absolutely essential to balance strategic autonomy and resilience with a need for openness and globalization. At the same time, investment in domestic production, R&D, and innovation is also an important area to this end. Such investments should be made in a balanced way. Let's take an example. Why are we having this chips war? Because while the US has the most advanced technology, it lacks the production capabilities when it comes to semiconductors. There are only 2 countries in the world that have a full stack development capabilities, that are Korea and China. There are still many areas requiring global cooperation, such as AI adoption, public health, climate response, cybersecurity, terrorism, etc., debt relief as well. One or a few countries just cannot deal with the magnitude of these global issues. And a review of important global institutions, such as the UN Security Council, the IMF, and the World Bank, as well as a commensurate adjustment, is critical for more legitimate, representative, and inclusive tackling of these issues. When the US-China power competition started, pundits around the world worried about deglobalization and decoupling. But deglobalization, as worried, has not happened. Instead, globalization has taken a form of friendshoring and regionalization. Of course, some scholars and researchers claim globalization has always been regionalization, not globalization in its full sense. Anyhow, this is what we see today, aimed at balancing resilience and openness and global cooperation. And also in line with this, and contrary to what was expected with the US-China rivalry, and in view of the non-functioning WTO, more countries are seeking bilateral, plurilateral, and regional trade agreements to reap the benefits of free trade. The UK, India, UK, Indonesia, Korea, UK, Korea, Malaysia, FTAs, among many others. And at the regional level, there is this regional comprehensive economic partnership where 15 countries have joined, and more countries in the region want to join this RCEP. For instance, Bangladesh wants to join RCEP. And there is this comprehensive progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, currently with 12 member countries. And Korea, for instance, also finds this is an opportune time to join CPTPP to expand its trade territory. Geopolitical and geoeconomic competition between major powers has brought supply chain disruption and thus the need for a global south to adjust and diversify supply chains. Such rivalry has affected the modus operandi of the international financial institutions, particularly in relation to debt relief of the global south. As said earlier, reform of decision-making structure and representation of international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank is required for fair representation and more equitable resource allocation for the global south. Their decision-making structure is a reflection of the economic landscape of the 1960s and the 1970s. For this, not just the global south, but also other countries underrepresented in these organizations should raise a collective voice with continuity. A very good forum is G20. But the G20 has not called for it in a strong and determined fashion since 2010 in Seoul, Korea, if I'm not terribly mistaken. You know, Korea is assuming the G20 presidency in 2028, and next year already will be a part of the G20 Troika leadership. I hope Korea will focus on realistic delivery, not a long list of affirmations, confirmations. The Global South wants economic engagement with major powers more than anything else. That said, economic engagement and the reform question do not always stay on the same page. For instance, during the 2008-9 global financial crisis, and especially immediately after the scandal of the then IMF managing director, Strauss-Kahn, there was a serious attempt led by US intellectuals to break from the conventional practice of a European heading the IMF and an American leading the World Bank. The often cited candidates then for the IMF managing director position included a Korean who used to be my boss, and one of your own from India, Dr. Alwalia. Then the Global South failed to rally behind the non-European candidate. So my question is, when a new such opportunity arrives, will the Global South collectively support a non-European candidate? Or will it compromise? The Global South will compromise for some economic benefits. With this question for all of us, let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's come back to that in the Q&A as well. And I think it's very good. Together, Apurva and Kyungjin, you have sort of painted the linkage between security and geoeconomics very well. And I think and basically security and commerce. I think this is a moment when we can pivot to inclusion. and what it takes to make a harmonious society and a healthy society. And this is also deeply embedded in what both of you have discussed. And this takes us to the way national communication happens. Digital platform can be a very good way of increasing inclusion, but they can also deepen dependency. And so how do we see digital, and I'm now turning to you, Catherine, because this is your area of expertise, how do we see digital sovereignty shaping the global South's development space?
Thank you very much. I won't say I'm an expert, but I hope I'm an educated amateur. Well, of course, the story is told. Digital inclusion has expanded extraordinarily across the global South, in Africa, and in Kenya, where I come from, in particular. We've seen mobile identity, mobile money, e-government, e-commerce, massive use of social media, and massive participation. And these tools have brought millions into the digital economy and administrative system. But inclusion without sovereignty has created a new form of digital capture, because we are included at what I'm calling the consumer level, and have become increasingly vulnerable to the other levels, which include the infrastructure, which is largely foreign-owned. This includes cloud hosting, which was sold when I was part of the Kenya government as an accelerator, a cost advantage, a solution for obsolescence and difficult maintenance, but which has become a form of capture, because you can literally be externally shut down. And I don't think there's anything in international law that prevents it. So there's also the capture of the platforms. I don't always follow the news in South Africa, but I know in Kenya there's often huge demonstrations regarding the rideshare apps, where policy is made externally and yet affects thousands of workers in our jurisdiction, and over which our own government has limited control. But there's also the issue of the social media platforms, where we've seen very vigorous political action, for example, which again is outside the sovereign control of various regions. So these platforms are not neutral infrastructure. They're governed by commercial incentives. I remember recently having a long conversation with an AI platform regarding something that was happening globally. I finished at 11 p.m. at night, then I woke up very early in the morning because I was still thinking about it. But when I asked questions, the platform refused to answer them on the basis of platform policy. So I said, what happened between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m.? There was a policy change over which we had no control. Of course, that's a trivial example, but you can just imagine that you're actually being governed from abroad, because nothing would have prevented me from discussing that issue in my own jurisdiction. But now I was subject to policies and laws made elsewhere. There's also capability capture. This can be as simple as the dilution of local technical expertise. It becomes easier and easier to use these platforms, but we have less and less people who have deep technical knowledge to manage, build, or otherwise customize these applications for a particular domain. And this is becoming increasingly prevalent. So we don't know the code, we don't know the assumptions, we don't know the architectures, we don't know the governance models such as the policies which I have just discussed. They are secured externally, they are maintained externally, and the national learning curve is flat. We are learning nothing except how to use them better and better, and which makes us more captive, because increasingly we pay for these platforms in foreign currency. This is the silent form of capture that reshapes development trajectories. We also have governance issues. We get excited about local innovation. For example, in my own country, there's a lot of innovation of financial platforms, and we build ones that are very relevant to the global south, such as mobile money and mobile lending systems and so on. But none of them have globalized because the financial institutions, the financial standards are captured, and we have no say, and we can actually be locked out of the global ecosystem, regardless of how good our innovations are or how appropriate they are for the global south, the rest of Africa, and perhaps in our own jurisdiction, we are able to enjoy them. So digital inclusion has opened the development space if we take the consumer level digital inclusion as enough. But digital dependence is shrinking it again, because as the consumer inclusion increases, then the structural inclusion becomes more and more important, because there are changes we need to make, there are things we need to control. And if we're weak, we cannot do it. And so we are limited in the extent to which we can enjoy the fruits of our digital inclusion. So digital tech sovereignty is no longer a technical conversation. It is a development choice and a geopolitical necessity. So what do we need to do? I'm so happy to be here in a South-South, because I really agree with Approve that we need to start building together that structural inclusion that forms an alternative, because we have similar issues and similar problems, and we also have good examples. For example, I look at India having addressed many of those issues which I have discussed. We need to start leveraging what we have. I was reading the list of strategic minerals that we have in Africa that are very strategic and important to the whole ecosystem of technology, particularly cobalt, the PGMs, bauxite, lithium, coltan discovered recently in Kenya, and other minerals. Sometimes we think of them as just something that needs to be mined from the ground and sold, but they could be used to say that we're part of this chain and we have a say and we have some power, because this is where the whole chain starts, and therefore we can stop it. I don't want to follow China's example perhaps, but because this has become so important to us, then we have to look at our point of leverage in the short term, and perhaps our short-term area of leverage is that stage of the minerals. And I'll just quickly say that that would mean that Africa has to work together as a bloc, and also the South-South should also work together to look at our points of leverage and our points of power. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And that suggestion, I think, was truly a geoeconomist's way of reasoning, and it's very much, I think, attuned to where we are heading. And the risk factor that you mentioned, I would certainly single out as the most important at all, really shadowing all the others, because the dependency has no historical precedents, and we are also very soon inviting in new generations, Generation Z, Generation Alpha, who are brought up in a dependency relationship of the nature that you just described. Another very important channel of dependency and capture is finance, of course, trade and finance, which is precisely like what you described. It's also an opening for inclusion. So it poses a delicate challenge of increasing inclusion, but at the same time keeping a keen eye on capture and dependency. And for that, I'd like to hand over to Bohani.
Thank you very much, Jens. There's a risk that I could go on and on and on and on, but I do just want to make 3 key points only. I think firstly, recognize President Mbeki and all protocol observed. I want to make 3 key points only. 1, inclusion is not a philanthropic act. It's actually a driver of business profitability and sustainability. And the world is full of examples in telecoms, in finance, in retail, of businesses that are anchored around inclusion. And therefore, it is important that when we talk about inclusion, we should not be thinking about people with power and money feeling sorry for others. It's actually a business opportunity which, for many businesses, is the main driver of both profitability and sustainability. And I want to make 2 points, therefore, with respect to this question of both financial and trade capture. And I think the risks are actually the opportunities, interestingly. I think the first risk that we must highlight is the shape of trade in our countries across the continent. Where we still export, raw materials and import finished goods. I speak a lot in my role in the bank around trade finance and access to trade finance and driving intra-Africa trade. But actually, the first starting point of driving intra-Africa trade is ensuring that we can make goods and services, finished goods and services, which are acceptable and can be replacements for what we buy from elsewhere in the world. So that's the first point I do want to make, is that the shape of our trade is both a risk in terms of capture, continued capture, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity because we now have the AFCFTA, and we've agreed on a protocol with 54 countries. We've agreed on a number of things around rules of origin and all of these kinds of things. What then becomes important is, I think somebody spoke about it, it's the ability to execute and be consistent in that execution and make sure that we can actually crystallize this opportunity and remove it from this, over-the-top discussions to a real business opportunity. The second part I do want to talk about in terms of these capture questions is about, and there's been a lot of discussions this week in the B20, G20 around the cost of capital in Africa. But I think the key point here is mobilizing domestic sources of funding across the board and ensuring that Africa and indeed the Global South, and I think the BRICS New Development Bank goes a long way in terms of dealing that, so Africa and the Global South become, instead of just consumers of capital, but actually mobilize internal capital to finance infrastructure, to finance, to open access. So we speak about digital infrastructure, transport, we speak about energy infrastructure, all of these things I think there's enough money in the global south, there's enough capital in the global south to make sure that there isn't a dependency on legacy financial institutions. This is both a risk and an opportunity for the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's, yeah, exactly. So now I think we can open up the floor for questions. With all these interventions, I think we have plenty of things to talk about, and both challenges and hopefully also ways forward and reasons for hope. So, yes, I think we have a question right here.
Hi, Ella Batan, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. I have a question and a comment, and it ties in with the discussion we've been having since this morning about digitalization, the use of AI, the use of social media. And my question is about how to make the use of digitalization safer for everyone in a space where we've seen a lot of misinformation, but also disinformation. And the second question is about how to make digitalization, but also the use of social media safer for all its users, including children. Because we are forgetting that more and more, the people using social media are our children. I don't know how many people watch the series Adolescence. It actually shows some of the risk of children using social media when it's not regulated and when there's not a way to make it safer for everyone. And now the comment on the discussion we had on the creative sector. I get a feeling, and I support the creative sector. I think it's a job employment sector for many people. But I also get a feeling sometimes that it might have provided an opportunity for government to actually escape the responsibility of creating jobs for everyone. It's not the responsibility of government alone, but I think it has become a sector where government often tend to say, okay, let them deal with creating jobs, let them be there, as long as they are not disturbing us. And there's a need to also do some regulation beyond having policy on cybersecurity. And even when you read some of the policy on cybersecurity, you see that some of them are not actually addressing cyber insecurity, but they might be drafted to actually try to see what the opposition is doing. So creative sector is good, but maybe we need some regulation on how to make digitalization safer for everyone, including children. And we might want to be inclusive of other expertise, especially when you look at children, maybe psychologists, bringing those into the discussion and trying to see what are the impact of all of that on all the users. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that very good question is probably earmarked for Catherine first, but everybody else. I think what I will suggest we do, we take the question for you, and then we round up here in the panel. Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Samson Ajayi. I'm a researcher, a business leader, and I am also a Nigerian. My question is, making reference to the previous sessions on the creative economy, I think one of the outcomes was that, maybe global service providers tend to exploit Africans from, fully maximizing those platforms. And one of the recommendations was that there is a need for a local adaptation of our solution, something adapted to our local reality. And when Catherine was making a reference, she mentioned initiatives that are localized, for example, M-Pesa, also have limited global scalability. Now, the question is, are we not in a divide here? Are we really sure that local solutions could really protect our national interests on a global scale? Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, yes.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Dominic again. When I read the question, can commerce and inclusion, security should coexist or can coexist? Yes, it's a must. The how, we can discuss that, but it's a must. And if we don't want them to coexist, we need to assume the choice and be consistent. And 2 examples. I'm leading the topic digital transformation in the automotive industry for the region Africa. One thing is, you can see in a country like Nigeria or Ghana, 75% to 90% of the used vehicles are imported from the US. But then, if you're looking for a part or the coding for the diagnostic tool to identify the fault on the car, you can't do that because our systems are not designed for American vehicles. And when I asked, but can we simply just get those data from the US here in Africa? They said, no, due to US export control. Man, do not sell your vehicles in Africa then, and assume that. Second thing is, as an example, and we were talking about digitization and e-commerce and everything, I face a challenge. And you will see in Africa, you will not have many countries, or very few, yeah, like South Africa, yes, some Northern Africa countries where you can have e-commerce platform for automotive products. Why not in Cote d'Ivoire? Why not in Niger? Why not in... Just one reason. We do not have data about the vehicle park. And from that point, we cannot develop e-commerce solutions because e-commerce is just a physical product. The purchasing process is digital, but at the end of the day, you get a physical product. Without data, we can't do much. How our African countries cannot just do the basic rights. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think the three questions really weave into each other. So what I would suggest we do is that I think the questions, many of the questions are really covering the field that you, Catherine, dealt with, and also I think Apur. If the other speakers also want to chip in, let's go ahead. But Catherine, do you want to talk first? I think we need to keep it pretty brief because we're out of time. But anyway.
Okay. On the question about misinformation, disinformation, and law, if you follow, you will see that the Kenya government was also almost being brought down because they were trying to update our cybersecurity legislation because of what our Gen Zs have been doing. You may not know, but there were some very serious demonstrations which spread to Tanzania, in which Kenyan youth were very active. I'm very ambivalent about that. I don't think this will be dealt with by law. I think it's going to be dealt with by norms and by sufficient incentives for good content. Our content creators are following the Western model of creating sensationalist content because that's what gets the likes and the money. If governments were investing in the creation of decent content, I'm sure people would get busy with that and less busy with fomenting dissent or creating really negative content. But it's a very big topic, and I understand the concern, especially for parents with young children. Of course, we can have gateways and we can have other technological solutions like parent controls and so on, but it's not easy to stop your children from consuming negative content. On the question of are we ready to continentalize, is there such a word, our products? Yes, why not? I believe in something called the psychological infrastructure, which has never been built in Africa. We don't believe in ourselves. And that is why we continue importing even the simplest products and goods. That would change because even if the quality was not good enough to begin with, the market would eventually demand the quality and we would rise to the challenge. So I agree that there is a risk, but there's also the risk which the other gentleman told us about, because we're being sold products without data, which creates the dependency. I need to stop there. I know that.
We will not
Yes.
exhaust this topic for sure. Very, very briefly, I don't know if, Eugene, do you want to yield your time? Okay, Bohani, you wanted to say a few words, and then Apurva to round it off.
I just want to say one thing. A lot of what we're discussing here could be solved through deep domestic capital markets in the continent. What we're talking about in terms of products we're consuming and all of that, we could solve a lot of that if we just ensured that we can mobilize domestic sources of capital, domestic funding within the continent, which means we would actually have the right and the ability to dictate on what happens in these products and services. It's unfortunate, but the truth it's that these are realistically questions of financing and capital that we're talking about here. Thanks.
Yeah, and ironically and sadly, external stakeholders will not recommend that solution, which is really, but at the very good point, I think, that we need to bring with.
Yeah, gents, let me just end with a larger philosophical point, which is that the epoch of global integration, which made economic weaponization possible, was actually hugely beneficial to the global south. I mean, the share of low and middle income countries in global exports between 1995 and 2022 almost doubled. And in that period, the number of people living in absolute poverty in our countries came down from 40% to 10% as calculated by the World Bank. So this is not a zero-sum game between the global north and the global south. Dependence is essential for our collective prosperity. What we have to think about is canalized dependence. Dependence with guardrails and a safety switch. Dependence, strategic autonomy cannot come at the cost of prosperity. And just because we live in a more contested world does not mean the end of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for the next edition, we probably would need to have a day or so to deal with these type of topics. But we did our best for 40 minutes. Thank you, everyone.